Hi everyone, welcome to this exclusive episode of Palestinapodden.
We've been very fortunate to have Omar Barghouti as a guest, the co-founder of the BDS movement. He will be talking about the movement itself and what we can do to prevent what's happening in Palestine right now. It's a very long episode, so we've decided that we're going to show you the episode in its entirety, and then we're going to talk about the news and harakat and stuff in the next week's episode. But for now, we hope you enjoy this talk with Omar, and as always, Free Palestine.
Free Palestine.
Today we're speaking with Omar Barghouti, who's a Palestinian human rights defender and is one of the co-founders of BDS, Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions. He's also one of the founders of the Palestinian campaign for academic and cultural boycott of Israel in Ramallah and West Bank, which is a part of the BDS. He has been advocating for Palestinian human rights for decades, and we hope that you all give him a warm welcome. Please welcome to the stage, Omar. Yes. Hello.
Hi.
How are you?
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you so much for joining us. Could you please start off just explaining what the BDS movement is and what's the main purpose and goal of it?
The BDS movement was established in 2005 by the absolute majority in Palestinian civil society inside historic Palestine as well as in exile. So the refugee communities outside Palestine were also represented in the launch in 2005. It called for ending the occupation, ending the system of racial domination, which meets the UN definition of apartheid, something that for some reason Norwegian officials cannot spell and don't want to talk about, and the right of Palestinian refugees to return. By focusing on the three basic rights, basically we asserted that the Palestinian people is not just those in the West Bank and Gaza. West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza, the 1967 occupied territory, Palestinians there represent only 38% of the Palestinian people. 12% are Palestinian citizens of present-day Israel, and 50% of our people are in exile. In addition to those in exile, inside historic Palestine, there's a very large minority of internally displaced persons, internal refugees. So together with the exilic community, the exiled communities, the refugees constitute 68% of the Palestinian people. So BDS called for ending the occupation, ending apartheid, for the right of return for refugees. Refugees are the most important component of the Palestinian people. To achieve that, we were inspired by the South African anti-apartheid movement, the US civil rights movement, but mainly BDS is rooted in a very long heritage of Palestinian popular resistance. For 100 years, Palestinians have been struggling against British colonialism and then Zionist settler colonialism in Palestine. A very important point about BDS is that it is anchored in international law, in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and therefore it rejects all forms of racism and discrimination, including Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, anti-Black racism, and so on. Finally, the theory of change of BDS. What's new? I mean, since we've been doing boycotts for many decades, what's new about BDS in 2005? It is this organic connection between our popular resistance in Palestine and solidarity, meaningful solidarity internationally. In other words, demonstrations and articles and so on are important, but insufficient to end Israel's regime of settler colonialism, apartheid, and occupation. We need to cut the links of complicity by states, by corporations, by institutions. And without that, Palestinians cannot achieve liberation. So we connected the two. Without effective, meaningful international solidarity, we cannot achieve liberation. So our struggle has to be coupled with a very meaningful, effective solidarity movement that cuts the links of complicity. And it's not just states, it's also corporations and institutions, universities, cultural centers, and so on.
Is BDS a global movement? And if so, can you give us an example of where it is active?
It is a very global movement because that's the whole point of BDS. It is active in all continents, in most countries, or a very large number of countries, tens of countries, including countries as diverse as Indonesia, India, South Africa, Chile, Brazil, and the global north, across Europe, the United States, Canada, and so on. So it's really everywhere. It's active most in countries where there's some margin of democratic civil rights. We don't work well in dictatorships for obvious reasons, because there isn't a possibility to work with civil society under a dictatorship, including Arab dictatorships, of course. So our activists in some living under Arab dictatorships have to go underground, basically doing non-violent, international law-based BDS work. They cannot do it publicly. But in many countries, we challenge authorities. So it's BDS is not a one-size-fits-all. It's context sensitive, which means you don't copy-paste tactics. What works in South Africa may not work in Norway. What works in Japan will not work in the US. So we have to adapt according to the context. What we don't change are the principles. The principles remain the same in every country. It's just the tactics change depending on the context.
Mm. So it's a large movement, but you were also saying, so when we think of boycott, we usually think about like economy, like McDonald's and Starbucks, and we try and boycott. We have those kind of targets, but there's also cultural and academic and institutions, as you were saying earlier. Why are those BDS campaigns as important?
Okay. Well, BDS, just to explain the three letters, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions. Boycott, as you rightly said, is not just consumer boycotts, not just against companies. McDonald's definitely is one of our biggest targets, but there's so many companies that we target. But in targeting companies, we are strategic. We don't believe in those long lists of 100 companies, because no one will boycott 100 companies. Mm-hmm. We focus on a few companies according to criteria. I can get into the criteria later. Mm-hmm. So that's as far as boycott of consumer goods. But boycott is also about academic, cultural, sports boycotts. So for example, now we have a strong campaign to expel Israel from Eurovision and to boycott Eurovision if they insist on not expelling Israel. Because Israel is not just an apartheid state, it's a state that is committing a live stream genocide. It should not be allowed to whitewash or artwash, as we call it, mm-hmm. its genocide by appearing as a normal state, enjoying life and music as if nothing is happening. So that's also part of the boycott. It's important because Israel, as a settler colony, has used academia especially, but also culture, to whitewash, to hide its system of oppression, to try to appear as part of the so-called liberal Western world. Academia plays an even much more sinister role than the culture. Academia in Israel has always been part of the settler colonial system of oppression. It's not complicit, it's a partner, it's a complete pillar in Israel's system of oppression. All academic institutions in Israel are part of the system of oppression. So when we call on Norwegian universities to boycott Israeli universities, it's because those universities are complicit in crimes, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and now genocide, the crime of crimes. But some Norwegian universities' administrations may be sensitive to the B word, boycott. We're not stuck on semantics. Don't call it boycott. End universities' complicity in harming Palestinians. If you have a project between a university, let's say the University of Oslo, with a department in Haifa University or Tel Aviv University. And this department and this university are deeply complicit, deeply implicated in the system of oppression, then this project harms us because it helps the university appear normal. You normalize it. So we're asking the University of Oslo, don't harm us. End your involvement in unethical, illegal projects that harm Palestinians. So we're not asking for charity. We're not asking for charity. We're demanding, stop harming us. We're demanding that of government, the Norwegian government, which is harming us in many ways, and we can get to that, from Norwegian institutions, the Norwegian oil fund. The biggest harm to us in Norway is done by the oil fund. And we need to discuss that. And young Norwegians in particular have to see that. So that's as far as the boycott. Divestment is pushing, like the oil fund, to divest from companies that are doing harm, that are committing war crimes. So that's the issue of divestment. Sanctions are the last, and no coincidence it's last, because we need a lot of B and D to get to the S. We need a lot of boycotts, divestment to build people power to affect policy change. We can't change policy at government level without having enough people power. And Norway is an excellent example where we can build a lot of people power because obviously we have a lot of support in Norway. We shouldn't accept the Norwegian government's lies and attempts to appear as if it's doing good for Palestinians. It's not doing good for Palestinians, and it's about time that the Norwegian public protests what this government is doing. Exactly.
I just want to ask a quick, we were saying about the oil fund, because we have been protesting the oil fund. We know that it's one of the biggest investors of European countries is the oil fund. And we've had several activists blocking the entrances, and we've sent emails and all these kind of things. But what else can we do? It's an open question. But
okay, I'm not an expert in Norway, so I wouldn't know what tactics. Again, BDS is context sensitive. So I'm sure all of you know much more than I how best to move things in Norway. But I have a general comment to make, because in every meeting I've had, yes, I've been here only 2 days, but I had like 16 meetings. But in every meeting I've had, people tell me about Norwegian culture, how everything has to be harmonious and nice and cold and dialogue and cold and no passion and cold. And I think we need to warm things up a bit, because at the rate Norwegians are going, all Palestinians will be killed before Norway ends its complicity. We can't wait for this glacial pace because of the snow, it goes at we can't. Norway has to stop its complicity in crimes now. We can't wait. And the most important thing is that many Norwegians don't know. So in many meetings I've had, people were quite surprised when I said, your government is complicit in genocide. It's not a minor statement to say. And the Norwegian government, likes to think, oh, we're much better than Germany. That doesn't say anything. Everyone is better than Germany. I mean, it's a pre-fascist country. I mean, anyone is better than Germany. So yes, you're better than Germany, but you're horrible for us still. So on the scale of horror, you're better than Germany, but you're still horrific. Because the oil fund is invested in military manufacturers, military companies, especially US military companies, that are arming Israel now, that are helping Israel commit the genocide, that are killing our people in Gaza, destroying our hospitals, our universities now. And Norway is profiting from the genocide through its investments in those military companies. So that's a very direct connection of complicity. But even forget the genocide. Life did not start on October 7th. For decades, Norway has been invested in companies doing business in settlements for decades. Norway is the biggest investor in Europe in settlement business, in companies doing business in settlements, to be accurate. Norway is number one in Europe. worse than Germany, worse than France. So there's a lot to be done, but first let's pierce that bubble of myth that Norway is doing good for humanity. Yeah, don't pat yourself on the back. You're doing horrible things for us.
Yeah. We know.
We know.
We do know.
Yeah.
We just don't know how to,
Yeah.
what to do anymore in a way. But
Well, there are elections, and polls are saying some 3/4 of Norwegians support Palestinian rights.
yeah,
I'm not a politician, obviously, but there must be some way of leveraging this massive grassroots support into electoral power.
absolutely.
For example, Palestine Solidarity Campaign in the United Kingdom, one of the oldest solidarity groups in Europe, sends every candidate in the elections a number of questions. And they tell them, based on your answers, we will tell our base to vote for you or not. And Palestine Solidarity Campaign has tens of thousands of members and has a lot of impact, is connected to the old trade unions. All of them are affiliated, most of them are affiliated to PSC. So politicians do care what PSC does. So maybe that's one tactic that can be used. I mean, the Palestine Committee here has grown a lot, especially during this genocide, thousands and thousands of members. Many young people, the labor youth, the YMCA, WCA young people, there's so many young people that are fully supportive of Palestinian rights, of BDS. How can we leverage that to tell politicians, guess what? You will not get our vote if you don't stop your military trade with Israel, indirect military trade, if you don't divest from military companies killing Palestinians and from the settlement business. Unless you do those three things, you won't get our vote. Again, I don't know how to do that, but maybe other people that are much more knowledgeable than I can.
We'll all have a meeting afterwards and figure it out.
With the current situation in Gaza, how could BDS affect the situation?
There is no easy way, there's no fast way, because it's all about power. So BDS is about ethics, about the law, and about power. Those are the three elements. We have to be ethical, we have to be ethically consistent, we have to base what we do on international law and principles of human rights, despite the collapse of the international law system, as not just the BDS movement is saying, as the UN Secretary General is saying. This international law system is collapsing. We're entering a phase of total chaos and total impunity. And Mr. Guterres is not Che Guevara. So when he says that, you know how bad things are. So what we do is we escalate all our campaigns at a much faster pace. Yesterday we launched a big campaign against Intel, the chip manufacturer, for example. It will be one of our biggest campaigns ever because Intel is one of the largest high-tech companies in the world. Intel, in the midst of genocide, decided to invest $25 billion to expand its factory, which is built on an ethnically cleansed Palestinian village south of Tel Aviv, 16 miles from Gaza. So in the Gaza ghetto, while people are being destroyed, exterminated, annihilated, Intel wants to invest in Israel because they love Israel and Israel. So it does not even make sense financially to invest that close to Gaza. It does not make sense, but they're still investing. So we're going after Intel with all our power. We're also exposing many governments. We're also attacking parties that have not taken a position. We're pressuring churches. We're pressuring trade unions. So we have a lot of support among trade unions, but are they doing enough? No, they're not. We need to see trade unions divest entirely from companies involved in harming Palestinians, and we need to see them pressure governments more because they have power with numbers. So we're doing all that during this genocide. But what increased a lot for us is pressuring political parties in parliaments because we can't wait for the Norwegian rate of things. Building power so slowly, grassroots, trade unions, civil society affect parliaments, then we need to go faster, so we have gone faster. We started to do a lot of pressure on members of parliament in many, many countries across the world. Some examples, because you might think, okay, we're trying, but it's nice, but nothing really works. Well, In Malaysia, for example, BDS Malaysia led a campaign that ultimately ended with the government of Malaysia banning all ships headed to Israel from using ports of Malaysia. In Japan, just a couple of weeks ago, BDS Japan, in a very big coalition in Japan, pressured the government and pressured private companies. Two of the biggest Japanese companies, Itochu and Nippon Aviation, ended their relationship with Elbit Systems, Israel's largest private military company. So those Japanese companies got the memo that the International Court of Justice decision on the 26th of January that Israel is plausibly committing genocide. That means a very high risk of genocide, means that every company, every state, every institution that is complicit will be complicit in genocide, possibly. And even before we reach the final conclusion that it is genocide or not at the court, it might take years, the fact that there's plausibility of genocide triggers the responsibility to act to prevent genocide. So states like the Norwegian government cannot say, oh, we have to wait for the court to decide. No, you don't. And those who say that are ignorant. They don't know international law. The Genocide Convention says the moment you know there's a risk of genocide, immediately your responsibility, your obligations are triggered. You have to act to prevent genocide. In late February, dozens of UN experts, human rights experts, issued a very, very important statement saying, based on this risk of genocide, all states have an obligation to impose a full military embargo on Israel and to impose sanctions, trade sanctions, financial sanctions, and so on and so forth. So they're saying that's what the law says. So if a Norwegian politician claims otherwise, they're either lying or they're ignorant.
You were saying about Intel and now speaking about the politicians as well. What other important targets are there for us to BDS to stop the genocide in Gaza?
BDS alone will not stop the genocide.
No.
It has to be a massive effort.
Of course.
And it has to be massive pressure on the United States, which is a complete partner in crime. And this pressure on the United States has to be from outside and inside. Isolating the US, going after US companies that are involved in the genocide, or whitewashing the genocide, or supporting Israel's apartheid. That is very important. That's why Intel, McDonald's, and all these companies, all of them are American companies. It's no coincidence. First, because they're very complicit, and because they're very involved in this. So we need that pressure on the US. To do that, we can't think of the big picture and say, how can I move the elephant? I can't. We're too small to move the elephant. But maybe if we all push parts of the elephant, we can get to move the elephant. I can't alone move the whole elephant, but if I push a little bit and you push a bit and everyone pushes a little bit, then we can push the elephant. Which means if everyone looks at their sphere of relative influence, their domain of relative influence. I'm a member of a university staff. I'm a member of a trade union. I'm a worker in a school. Wherever you are, you have some influence, some domain of influence. So instead of saying, how can I move the big picture? Think of moving your small picture and to connect the dots, basically. If I can move my school to do the right thing, my university, my trade union, my hospital, and so on and so forth, imagine what would happen to society. Then government, politicians, if they all do one thing, they watch the polls. All politicians across the world, they watch the polls. They see suddenly all these universities are, ending relations with complicit Israeli universities, all those theaters, all those artists calling for Eurovision expelling Israel, and so on and so forth. They get the message. Oh, so we have to move. What's my example? Canada. Among the worst in the Wild West club of colonial powers, Canada is among the worst. And it's a settler colony like Israel, so there's a lot of family affinity. And it's a poodle of the United States. They follow US orders, even worse than Norway, as if you can imagine. So even Canada, which is not as rich as Norway, and completely under US control, yesterday decided a military embargo against Israel. Even Trudeau, I mean, doesn't get much worse. Trudeau voted for a military embargo. Imagine. So if God-forsaken Canada can do this, I'm sure Norway can as well. So, and it's just as cold. So
We have no excuses.
yeah, no excuse.
We can do one more before
Yeah.
we have to break the
Yeah.
flood. How is the Israeli economy affected by their warfare and occupation of Palestine?
The Israeli, okay, we have two phases, I guess, or more than two phases, but just to simplify it, because it's a very, very complex question. Before the Oslo Accords, the horrible Oslo Accords, Israel was very modest economy. Most of the countries in the world did not do business with Israel. Most of the countries in the world did not have relations with Israel. So some trade was happening under the table, but there wasn't much of a trade going on, except, the United States and Europe, but not much of the rest of the world. After the Oslo Accords, which is, it will go down in history as the beginning of building impunity for Israel that has led to the genocide. So Norway has been complicit even much more than before since 1993, since the Oslo Accords. Norway gave Israel this gift of unprecedented impunity, whereby it put the slave and the slave master in a room and said, negotiate how to maintain slavery, but be nice. That is the Norwegian solution. And that gave Israel the impunity that built up to the current moment of genocide. So we have to connect the dots. Before Oslo, the Israeli economy was very, very modest, very small. After the Oslo agreements, and mainly because of the corruption of the Palestinian leadership that signed Oslo, that did not represent the interests of the Palestinian people. And now almost every Palestinian, except the most corrupt, recognize that the Oslo Accords definitely was a disaster for Palestinians. But the biggest winner, the peace dividend, was for Israel. And there was no peace for us. Settlements kept growing, ethnic cleansing kept growing, the killing continued, but it was peace for the oppressor. So Oslo was the gift of peace for the oppressor. And the oppressor enjoyed the peace dividend. Suddenly, every country on earth almost had relations with Israel, and trade boomed. And Israel became what it is today, a much bigger economy. Fast forward to 2022, end of 22, beginning of 23. With the election of the far-right government in Israel, with a very strong fascist element, for the first time ever, that Israeli society is led by fascist elements in government, and that far-right government's agenda of undermining the justice system that served the settler colony very well, hiding its crimes and so on, they wanted to destroy it, to diminish its power for their own agenda. We can't get into too much detail now, but for their own Zionist agenda, ultra-Zionist agenda, they wanted to diminish the power of the courts. But as many Israeli analysts said, the Israeli Supreme Court is our legal iron dome. It has protected all our war criminals against international law. Because if you have the justice system functioning in a supposedly democratic country, then you don't have to take them to court internationally. That was if you destroy the Supreme Court in Israel, then the ICC will be at the door. If you cannot handle justice in Israel, we have to handle it for you. So that judiciary reform, what they called it, the far right, split the Israeli settler society, the settler colony basically, into almost two equal parts, with one part opposed to the far-right government, one part totally defending the far-right government. The message sent to investors, to companies, was that Israel is no longer safe for investment. And that led to a deluge of companies leaving Israel. Investments in Israeli high-tech dropped sharply, 73%, I think, in 2023. And high-tech in Israel is 50% of the exports. 50%. So it's not minor when investment drops by 3/4 almost. That's a disaster for the Israeli economy. So the Israeli economy, even before October 7th, was suffering massive changes, negative changes. Since the genocide, the beginning of the genocide, it has gotten much, much worse. So now Israel looks much worse for investment, and Moody's downgraded Israel's rating, you'll be surprised, for the first time in its history. So the United States was downgraded. Every country almost on earth was downgraded at one point, not Israel. Not Israel. It's above international law, above all measures. But finally, Moody's downgraded Israel during this genocide for the obvious reasons. And investors are pulling out even more. Israeli companies are leaving Israel, moving to the United States, Portugal, everywhere else. So the Israeli economy is suffering tremendously. Tourism has collapsed completely. And with the number of people in reserve duty that are committing the genocide, many economic functions are frozen, basically. And with the expulsion en masse of Palestinian laborers, the agricultural sector is suffering, the construction sector is suffering, and many other sectors are suffering in the economy.
What effect has boycott previously shown? Do you have any examples of success stories?
In BDS or boycotts before BDS, you mean around the world?
In BDS.
In BDS, okay. Since we don't have 13 hours, I suggest people go to the website, BDS movement, one word, bdsmovement.net. And you can see a lot, and on social media, of course, Instagram, all of them, X, and so on. Just very, very quickly, G4S, one of the largest security company in the world, we forced it to abandon the Israeli market entirely because it was involved in illegal business, and after a several-year campaign harming its reputation, as even the Financial Times editorial board admitted, they had an editorial about how the BDS movement hurt the reputation of G4S, exposing its involvement in crimes, basically. So it left. Why is this important? Because it's a security company. It's very difficult to affect any big corporation, let alone a security corporation that doesn't care about anything. It does security, and it's a British company. So, easy to hate. So we mobilized a lot of pressure against it, and we won, basically. That's one example, but there are several other campaigns that we've won. Veolia, for example, was, I think, our biggest win until 2015. Veolia is a French conglomerate that was involved in illegal tram in Jerusalem, water, sanitation projects that are illegal. So we had a 7-year campaign. And the biggest hit against Veolia was in Stockholm in 2010, right after the massacre in Gaza, 2008-2009. They lost $1 billion after another until they lost more than $20 billion worth of contracts due to BDS. And they finally left Israel completely. Orange Telecommunications left Israel, and so on. So there were many companies. Pension funds that have divested because of pressure from BDS supporters and partners like trade unions. So trade unions in Norway, Fagforbundet and LO, have played a very important role in pressuring the oil fund. So the oil fund is still horribly complicit, but whatever little it did came because of pressure, mainly from trade unions and civil society, Norwegian People's Aid, and so on. So we understand that only pressure works with these situations. But also the Dutch pension fund, the New Zealand pension fund, Luxembourg, and others have divested. Even the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation divested from G4S because of pressure of BDS. The biggest churches in the US, the Presbyterian Church, the United Methodist Church, the United Church of Christ, have all divested from several companies involved in the occupation. That was the work of BDS partners in the United States, inside the churches. At the academic level, other than the wonderful news from Norwegian universities, cutting relations with departments or with universities, Israeli universities that are involved in crimes. In the United States, major academic associations like the Anthropological Association and many others have endorsed BDS completely, which is a boycott against institutions, not individuals. In the cultural sphere, so many artists have cancelled performances. I'm talking before October 7th, obviously, have cancelled performances in Tel Aviv. From Shakira to many, many, many names. No time to go over the names now. But many of them cancelled just a week before a sold-out concert with 50,000 tickets sold. So it was a big hit to the reputation of apartheid Israel, that when those big artists cancel, their millions and millions of fans get educated very quickly in the campaign. So when they go to the supermarket the next day, they will not buy Israeli avocados because they learned from the Shakira campaign that there's something really rotten about this system. It's apartheid, and so they learn a lot through it. Fans that usually do not care about politics, during this genocide, all those, especially the younger generation, some call them the TikTok generation, has been leading a lot of actions across the world. Peaceful disruptions, occupations, sit-ins, walking out of schools, high schools. This has happened across the world, and the BDS movement has played a role in that process. So in every level, we've had a lot of successes, and the most important success is that despite the divisions in Palestinian society, BDS is an oasis in this desert because it's a consensus movement. The entire spectrum of Palestinian society supports BDS. It's supported by a near consensus. And that's our strongest moral authority, basically, that we are supported by our people. We don't belong to any party, we don't belong to any ideology, we belong to the Palestinian people, and that's why we have a voice that's a very strong voice. And we've built a network of allies and partners across the world that have tens of millions of members. Tens of millions. In Norway, that might sound like an exaggeration, but I'm not exaggerating. The biggest farmers' union in India that supported BDS has 16 million members, 3 times the population of Norway. One union. The Democratic Women's Union in India has 10 million members, endorse BDS, and so on. So I can go on.
Double Norway.
Double Norway.
Yeah.
That's just the women's union.
Yeah.
You talked about the young generation, the TikTok generation. Dr. Mats Gilbert also talked about the young generation, how important they are right now. Why do you think they are so important?
I think because they are not fooled by the traditional complicit media. They're not fooled by the traditional establishment, the talking heads of governments across the West. They sound like robots, like some AI program speaking, not like humans who can relate to a genocide. So you ask one of those politicians in a very fancy suit, there's a genocide happening and your government is involved by selling weapons. We are doing everything we can to push for the peace process. What the hell is the peace process? What peace process are you talking? It's a genocide. So again, it's like AI, but gone wrong, programmed the wrong way. So I think it's the younger generation is not fooled by that. The second factor is that I have 2 daughters that belong to this generation, I mean slightly older. They see their friends and their colleagues, they see what's happening in Gaza as a beginning of a new phase of savagery, of depraved violence that has never happened before, and it has never happened before in terms of being televised. Much worse crimes happened across the world, much worse. But this is the first televised genocide ever. Not even the US empire ever tried to televise its genocides. So this is the first, which means the world has entered a new phase of savagery whereby the international legal system is collapsing, as the UN Secretary General said, as I said earlier. The young generation sees this and says, what kind of world are we growing up in? The very basic protections against this brutality, international law and human rights, are collapsing before our eyes. And our governments are lying, our corporations are lying and they're all complicit. We don't want that. The final point is that we've been saying this for a long time, and I think younger people get it much faster, that repression against Palestinians, against pro-Palestinian voices, some people think it will stop there. They want to go after BDS and shut it down in every university across the West, not yet in Norway, but across the West, in every country. The Netherlands, supposed liberal countries, repression is everywhere, like never before. And I'm old enough to know I've never seen this level of repression in liberal democracies. And I'm never fooled by liberal democracies. I know exactly what they stand for. But I've never seen this level of repression. I've always said, since the anti-BDS legislation started passing in the US, one state after another, they will not stop at BDS or Palestine. If they succeed in violating freedom of expression against us, they will go after every justice movement and no one will be safe. They'll go after the trade unions, they'll go after the black justice movements, the climate justice, the women's rights movement. Indeed, the anti-BDS legislation in the United States, in every state, has been used as a template against women's reproductive rights, against black voting rights, against climate justice activism, and so on and so forth. The exact wording. They just remove BDS and put climate justice, remove women's reproductive rights. So what we've been warning about is happening, and it's crossing the Atlantic. Repression will not stop at Palestine. The powers that be, the 1% that serve corporations, they don't serve people, will go after every dissenting voice. Trade unions will not be safe, all justice movements will not be safe. So I think young people get that. So it's very intersectional. They get the intersectionality of power. They get the intersectionality of struggle. Powers are intersectional, so we have to be intersectional to fight them.
I agree in a way. I understand. Also, it's so unfiltered right now as well. Everything that we see, we're not just like when there used to be just one state channel.
Exactly.
And you just watch whatever is on the news, and now we watch the state channel now, for example, and they might be telling something else different than what we see on TikTok or Instagram or Al Jazeera, even that.
Yes.
So it's good.
Yes.
Finally, people are waking up. But older people should also wake up. What do you think are the most important things to boycott at the moment?
That's a very broad question.
Yeah.
There's so much to boycott in terms of institutions or culture or...
But if I put it in context, so the past few months, a lot of people have been wanting to boycott. So they boycott McDonald's and they boycott
consumers.
In consumption, let's say that.
Okay.
Just
McDonald's
because
definitely is a high priority.
Yeah.
Because it's everywhere.
Yeah.
So it's a very good target.
Yeah.
And because the Israeli franchisee of McDonald's gave free meals to the soldiers going to perpetrate the genocide, basically. So it's ugly. It's really ugly. And the parent company did not do anything, although they can terminate the contract with them based on the law, because they've tarnished the reputation of McDonald's. And it's horrible food anyway. It's junk food.
It is terrible.
Why not boycott it anyway? For health reasons, for humanity, for the climate, and for Palestinians, boycott it. Hewlett-Packard, HP computers, they're everywhere. Even some trade unions that support Palestinian rights have HP computers. This should not continue. HP gives Israel the servers that are used in the population registry, which is the apartheid pillar, basically, that's powered by HP. So we need to exclude HP. Students buying HP laptops, okay, if you already have an HP, just cover it with a sticker, but don't buy a new one. So don't throw it away, obviously, you've already paid. They already profited from you. Don't throw it away. So on our website, the BDS-movement.net, you'll find a few companies that we're calling for targeting, because again, we don't want to target every boycottable company. If people can, fine. Yeah. But if they can't, focus on one. If we all boycott McDonald's, it will feel it. It's already feeling it. The CEO is shouting, we're losing revenues, we're losing profits. Our share price is plummeting. Wonderful. Let's give them more news.
Good. Yeah, because I think there's a lot of confusion about what to boycott and not what to boycott, because people keep coming with things. Obviously, everything is somehow connected to Israel, I think. So there is a lot of...
But that doesn't work. That doesn't work. If you go after every boycottable... Maybe now I should talk about the criteria. How we
Please
target.
do, because that's what I want to get to the bottom of, because people boycott everything and then they end up just eating grass, and you're like, well, if you boycott one thing and no one else boycotts it, then it's not going to have an effect. So try and get more people to boycott that one thing.
Absolutely. To be effective, boycotts have to be collective.
Yeah.
If they're not collective, they're useless. It's a venting out of a feeling of that fine, but it's venting out frustration will not help Palestinians. It's when it's collective action that actually hurts the bottom line of companies, then it has an impact. So we have 4 criteria how we select a target. And again, it's context sensitive. So our partners in Norway, the Palestine Committee or BDS, they can choose targets that make sense in the Norwegian setting. So I would go to them first. What do you suggest? But in general, there are 4 criteria for selecting a target. First, level of complicity, which means if you have 2 companies, one much more complicit than the other, obviously you go after the more complicit. One selling weapons and one selling flowers. Both are complicit, but go after the weapons. Obviously, it's more complicit. Second, cross-movement interest or intersectionality. So if you have a company that only violates Palestinian rights, or a company like McDonnell Douglas, like all those weapons companies that violates Palestinian rights as well as many, many other rights, go after the latter because it allows us to build intersectional cross-movement coalitions. So if a company is harming the environment and Palestinians, great. We form coalitions with the climate justice movement against that same company. And we're doing that. It's not hypothetical, that's what we're working on. So that's the second. The third, brand appeal. Prominence of the brand, media appeal. So if you have 2 companies, one very famous, McDonald's, the other XYZ that no one has heard of, go after the McDonald's. Because it's McDonald's, it'll be in the news. If it sneezes, Financial Times will cover it, and the whole world will cover it. So you go after the big brand. The 4th criterion is the potential for success, which means you only start a campaign against a boycottable target. There are many, many boycottable targets, but that doesn't mean we boycott them. We don't go after them in a campaign, organized campaign. We go after a target when we have a good chance of success. So if you asked me 2 years ago, would you target Intel? I would have told you no, actually. Intel has a near monopoly status. We cannot target it because we cannot win. It's in so many computers and telephones, we cannot win. But we found out in the last 2 years, it has slipped sharply. Intel's share has gone down in the chip industry from 90 to 70%. It's still big, but it's slipping. And competition from Taiwan and from Korea and from American companies is growing very fast. So it no longer controls the market. So we have a chance to go after it. And that's why we announced the Intel campaign now, not 2 years ago, because we can succeed. And we have a lot of research showing we can actually succeed against Intel. So potential for success is a very important criterion. We should never forget it, because we don't do BDS for fun. We don't do it to vent out our anger or frustration. Those are not good enough. That's not good enough. We do it strategically to achieve our goals, which is Palestinian rights. We do it to achieve Palestinian rights. So we keep that in front of us. Is this helping us get closer to Palestinian liberation or not? If it's not, drop it. Do something better.
Yes.
Let's zoom out a bit. Norwegian authorities say that unilateral sanctions are not efficient. Do you have a comment on that?
Okay. Well, first, it seems Norwegian politicians, some of them don't read their history, their own history. Norway was one of the few countries that led the boycott of South Africa, the sanctions against South Africa. It was, the last time I checked, Norway was even smaller then. If it's 5 million now, God knows how big it was then. It was a tiny, tiny little country in the frozen north. But it chose to be among the very first, along with Sweden, along with Ireland. They were the first in the world to push sanctions against apartheid South Africa. Whatever happened to that bright, noble history of Norway? Suddenly, they're so hypocritical that they're erasing their own history, let alone our history. They're erasing Norwegian history, bright history. So that's one thing. Second, well before sanctions, we're asking for fulfilling legal obligations. There's a very, very clear difference. Sanctions in general are understood as voluntary, discretionary measures that a state can decide based on what it feels like, its own political agenda. If Norway wants to freeze the assets of Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, it can choose to do so or not. Yeah, right? It's a sanction. But fulfilling your obligations is not voluntary. It's an obligation. Norwegian money is being used, investments are being used to commit genocide. Ending that is not a sanction, it's fulfilling your obligation under the Genocide Convention. You have no choice. If you don't do this, you're violating international law. And for a country that is so small, it should care about international law more than the big giants. So that's the first thing. It's ahistorical, that statement. It misses the point about fulfilling obligations, and they intentionally, I mean, politicians know that it's about fulfilling obligations, but they call it all sanctions. Oh, we're too small to do sanctions, so let's not go there.
Because they've sanctioned several countries,
Of course.
Syria, Afghanistan,
Russia. Which makes the least sense financially.
Yeah.
If you think about finance, because sometimes they talk very financially. You know, we're Norway, we have to maximize the profits and of the oil fund and so on. Well, divesting from Russia must have been the most stupid decision ever made from a financial perspective. But you did not think of financials. You thought of politics, legality, morality. What happened to that vis-a-vis Israel? And what Israel is doing in Gaza is 1,000 times worse in proportion to what the Russians are doing in Ukraine. Not that that is okay. That's not okay either. And there are crimes being committed. But they're multiplied by 1,000 are being committed by the Israelis against Palestinians in Gaza.
So why is it so difficult to sanction Israel?
Good question. I think U.S. domination on European politics.
Yeah.
This myth of sovereignty, European sovereignty, is just that. It's a myth. It's this NATO. What is NATO? U.S. domination over a number of countries that like to think they're sovereign, but they follow orders from Washington. Yeah. So Washington says it's okay to impose sanctions on a few criminal settlers, 3, I think, or 4. So there's a genocide that the U.S. is part of, but they're imposing sanctions on 4 settlers or 3 settlers. And suddenly Norway wants to impose sanctions on a few criminal settlers. How is that even close to justice? If we weren't having a genocide, this would be laughable. But in the midst of genocide, this is shameful to even say as if they're doing anything right. So I think it's difficult because they're following orders. That this international system that they've tried to fool us with is very much a Washington system, completely controlled by the US. And they just follow orders, except on minor issues. So I will give the devil's advocate. So a Norwegian politician will say, but we did not follow US orders vis-a-vis UNRWA, the UN agency that's serving Palestinian refugees. Not just in Gaza, all across the Arab world, and wherever Palestinian refugees are. And my answer to that, yes, great. You're much better than Germany, the US, Netherlands, Italy, France. That's true. But not being a criminal does not make you that great. That's not heroic. So the US, France, Germany, every country that has cut funds to UNRWA in the midst of genocide, where Israel is using starvation as a weapon of war, is directly involved in the genocide, as the Lemkin Institute for Genocide Prevention in the US has said. Every country that has cut aid to UNRWA now is guilty of being directly involved in the genocide. So bravo, Norway. You're not guilty in starving our people, but you're guilty in supplying the airplanes that kill our people otherwise.
Exactly.
Very heroic.
What difference has the ICJ ruling made in terms of BDS?
The ICJ ruling will go down in history, I think, as a new phase. If the genocide has brought us to a new phase, part of that is Israel, after 75 years, facing justice for genocide, the crime of crimes. They can never walk back from that, because Israel is not the United States or China, or it's not a major power. It's a small, relatively small settler colony that is entirely dependent on the West. And part of its legitimacy of its system of oppression is whitewashing it, hiding it behind this democratic facade. It's a democracy, so we allow it to do some crimes because it's a democracy. You know, democracies can do crimes. Look at the United States. Do you need any better example of a criminal state? Because it's a democracy, it's okay to kill a couple of million in Vietnam, and then in Iraq, and then Afghanistan, and so on and so forth. Latin America, death squads, you know, it's a democracy, the US, you can't blame it. So Israel is in the same laundry, basically, a democracy, so whitewash its crimes. Post 26 January, it can no longer claim that. In fact, today, I think, one of those institutions dominated by the US that rank democracies, finally, after 75 years, no longer considers Israel, after 50 years, no longer considers Israel a liberal democracy. They moved it down a bit. It's electoral democracy because of the problem of torture. So the genocide doesn't count. You know, killing flies doesn't count because we are considered, according to those Western-dominated institutions, flies, non-humans. But this is nothing new. 500 years of Western colonialism, they saw the rest of the world as non-human or semi-human, or what I call relative humans. So I think that's the dynamic that we're seeing.
Also, it's interesting, since we recently spoke about it as well, and the ICJ ruling for countries like Germany, France, Norway, who delivers airplanes. Have we some historic context of what has happened to those countries before that's been directly or indirectly involved?
With the ICJ ruling, they can no longer hide their complicity in possible genocide. It's plausible genocide, the court said. So Japan got the message and instructed, advised its companies to pull out of the worst projects. Canada got the message, finally, and decided to impose a military embargo. They followed the UN experts' statement of end of February, that the first thing you do when there's a potential genocide, risk of genocide, end military relations. That's the number one thing. Don't buy weapons, don't sell weapons, indirectly, directly, just stop. So I have no idea when Norway will get the memo that you are being accused, you will be accused of complicity in genocide. And I've always said it, we're too weak now, but life is changing. When we get more powerful, we will hold every official, every board member of every corporation accountable. We will have our Nuremberg moment when all those criminals will be held accountable for aiding and abetting genocide.
We have a couple more questions to you. I can see that the time is flying by. But when we talk about BDS and campaigns that we do against Israel and talk generally about Israel, we're often accused as being anti-Semitic. And there have been accusations that boycotting or the BDS movement in general is anti-Semitic. What is your response to that, and how do you think we should respond when we're met with these accusations?
Sure. How long do we have?
Because
I can go on and on. So give me how many minutes?
3 minutes.
3 minutes, okay. So I can just pick the first 16 points.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, first, the accusation that boycotting Israel is anti-Semitic, the accusation itself is anti-Semitic. And I've said this before, because the accusation presumes that Israel and the Jews are one and the same. If you're boycotting Israel, you're boycotting Jews. That equates Israel with Jews. That is very anti-Semitic because it reduces Jews to a monolithic sum, to one box, represented entirely by Israel, coextensive. Israel and Jews are coextensive, they're the same. This is extremely racist, extremely anti-Semitic, because it erases Jewish diversity, as if Jews are, unlike all humans, are one and the same. You don't have diversity in them, and that's very racist. So we should reject that out of hand. That's the first point. The second point is that BDS from the very beginning, not under anyone's pressure, in the BDS call of 2005, please read it, it calls on conscientious Jewish Israelis to join us in the struggle to dismantle this system of oppression. So from the very origins of BDS, we recognize that Jewish Israelis that are anti-Zionist, anti-colonial, are potential partners in the struggle to end oppression for everyone. Third, in the principles of BDS from the very beginning, because it is anchored in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, one of our principles is anti-racist, and anti-Semitism is mentioned there. We reject categorically all forms of racism, including and anti-Semitism. Because of that, there's a Jewish Israeli part of the BDS movement. It's small, but it's effective. Jewish support for BDS has grown exponentially in the United States, exponentially, especially younger Jewish Americans. You've all seen the occupations, peaceful occupations of Congress, Statue of Liberty, Grand Central Station, just such inspiring protests. Thousands and thousands of young, and some not very young, some Holocaust survivors actually, some really older, but mostly young Jewish Americans fully supporting BDS, saying not in our name, saying never again for anyone, and ceasefire now. Those are the three slogans they raised. They show the real face of how they see their faith, that what Israel is doing is not Jewish. Saying otherwise is anti-Semitic. So in a way, if you say attacking Israel is attacking Jews, you're saying that Israel equals Jews, and therefore everything Israel does is the responsibility of all Jews. And I've said this before, there's nothing Jewish about occupation, about apartheid, about ethnic cleansing, about the daily humiliation at checkpoints, about genocide. There's nothing Jewish about that. And therefore, there's nothing anti-Jewish in struggling to end those systems and structures of oppression and crime. Saying otherwise is anti-Semitic. Because then Jews will be responsible for every crime Israel is doing. And that is anti-Semitic. Because the accusation of anti-Semitism has not worked with Israel for many years, they and the Israel lobby had to develop the bogus, revisionist, fraudulent, and racist definition called the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, which is rejected by many progressive Jewish groups worldwide. For two reasons. Because it is designed to suppress advocacy of Palestinian rights. If you say Israel is an apartheid state, you're anti-Semitic. If you say Israel was based on ethnic cleansing of indigenous Palestinians, you're anti-Semitic. If you call for a boycott of Israel without mentioning 16 other countries, you're anti-Semitic, and so on. So it's designed to suppress advocacy of Palestinian rights. And in parallel, it throws Jewish communities under the bus. It undermines the real struggle against anti-Jewish racism by making it about Israel, not about Jews. Anti-Semitism is anti-Jewish hatred, bigotry, racism, violence against Jews for being Jews. Suddenly, this has become about Israel. So it's very dangerous for the real struggle to end anti-Semitism.
Bare kjapt. Kan jeg se hvor mange som har spørsmål fra salen? Bare vurdere hvor mange flere vi skal stille, og hvor mange dere ønsker å komme med. Alle som kommer til å stille spørsmål, opp med hånda. Ok. To?
Ja.
Good.
Ok.
Three people have questions. Okay, well, we have two more. We can skip. I think we'll go to that one. Say if the world leaders would fully have BDS to Israel. I made up a new term. Say if they fully BDS Israel, what would the potential outcome be, do you think?
The system of settler colonialism and apartheid would collapse. And we don't need the whole world, we need the United States.
Yeah.
If the United States alone would stop arming apartheid, would stop defending apartheid against accountability at the United Nations, in every international forum, the system cannot continue. Mm-hmm. Apartheid would collapse. And it's not hypothetical, we're not being romantic. We studied South Africa. We had very strong relations with those who led the South African struggle that ended apartheid. So we've learned a lot from their experience and many other experiences. The US Civil Rights Movement, we've studied those very well. And we've studied our own history. So we know the strengths of our enemy and we know the vulnerabilities. This system of oppression cannot exist without the massive complicity of states and institutions and corporations. We don't need every state on earth to implement BDS against Israel. It would take far, far, far less than that to make the system of oppression unsustainable.
You were talking about South Africa. Were there any particular BDS campaigns there that played a bigger part in dismantling the apartheid?
The boycotts and divestments and sanctions were one of the 4 pillars of struggle in South Africa. So without going into details, in those boycotts and divestments, there were some campaigns that were particularly symbolically extremely important, and some that were materially very, very important. For example, the sanctions on banks, SWIFT sanctions and so on, made it impossible to do banking with the apartheid regime, and that played a very important role in making it unsustainable, basically. But you'll be surprised, banning South African apartheid from rugby tournaments, from sports. And I said this earlier, for white Afrikaners, South Africans, not being able to play rugby with the British and the Australians and the others, that's the end of life. Life is not worth living. To them, they're obsessed with sports. To Israel, it would be academia. The equivalent to rugby would be the academic institutions. The moment Israeli academic institutions face isolation in Europe and the United States, life wouldn't be worth continuing. Then we have to end this apartheid regime. And academia, as I said in Israel, is a pillar in the system. So you lose one of the legs of the chair, it falls, basically.
Good.
Great.
We've talked about institutions. We've talked about McDonald's boycott. We've talked about doing what you can in your community, in your profession, in your... what more can we do? And where should our focus be?
Well, I mentioned it in my responses to other questions. The focus in Norway, the most important focus, is the oil fund. Obviously, Norway is small in terms of size of population and so on, but it's massive financially. And because of that massive fund, it's extremely important to target the oil fund. In my meetings, it became much more obvious to me why the oil fund is so complicit. It is designed to be criminal. It is designed to maximize profits irrespective of human rights and irrespective of international law. So they made the system give the appearance of deference to international law while it's really designed to ignore everything, human rights and international law, and just maximize profits. They set the guidelines so high that it's extremely difficult to meet their criteria to be excluded from the oil fund. So a company would have to be so obviously criminal to reach the extremely high standards of the oil fund and its so-called ethics council, which I call the unethical council, because it's by design allowing Norway to invest in crime, by design, not by accident. It's not a mistake. Because Norwegians like to think everything, oh, we can do better. Maybe if we talk, dialogue is a big thing in Norway. If we dialogue more with the Ethics Council and the oil fund, maybe we can get them to move there. But after 15 years of dialogue with the oil fund, they've divested from how many companies? You can count them on the fingers of the hand. That is not good enough. So that is the biggest target. The main target in the oil fund are two: settlement companies, companies involved in the Israeli occupied territory, the Palestinian territory, that's obvious, and the military, investment in weapons manufacturers that are killing Palestinians. Those are the obvious ones that I would begin with. So I think all pressure leading to affecting the oil fund helps. Whether it's parliaments, whether it's city councils, whether it's trade unions, whether it's universities. So in other words, in my institution, in my sphere of influence, I work to affect my own institution doing the right thing, divesting and so on. But there's another demand: push government. So whatever you do in the institution, add another demand: push government. The University of Oslo should end relations with Israeli universities and push government. LO should do 1, 2, 3 and push government. Everyone has a responsibility to push government, so long as you're still a functioning democracy. Who knows how long that will last?
Great, thank you very much.
Let's push the elephant together.
Yeah.
Yes.
Anine, vil du dele ut mikrofon?
Who has a question? You have a question. So let's go to you first.
Ja, der og der.
Yes.
Takk.
Yes, first.
Us? Okay.
And then I suggest taking two women, because usually women wait. And it ends up being all men who ask first.
Yeah. So we'll go Finn and then Madeleine and then Ammo.
Thank you very much, all of you. A question for Omar Barghouti. When you have talks with politicians, do they show any understanding in your private conversations that we do not hear when they speak officially? Do they understand what is going on? And second, I've seen the case that Nicaragua has brought against for the ICJ.
Against Germany.
Yeah, and they're seconding the South Africa.
Yes.
Can you tell us how it came to be that Nicaragua took this position? Is there a Palestinian community in Nicaragua or something similar? Thank you.
Okay, on the first question, I guess you meant politicians in Norway? In general. In general. Because in Norway I have not met politicians in government. They don't meet us. Why would they meet a Palestinian civil society representative from a non-violent movement calling for justice?
Good question.
It's so anti-Norwegian. But in some countries where politicians in government are more decent and do care about international law, when we meet with them, especially in the global south, and that connects to your second question, they are beyond frustrated, disappointed, they're disgusted with the Western-dominated international system. And it's not just the courts, it's not just the ICC being so complicit in enabling genocide. The International Criminal Court is criminal in enabling genocide. 6 months into a genocide, they haven't uttered a word to say there's a potential possible risk, to warn Israeli politicians that are day in and day out calling for genocide. I mean, they're not shy. And again, this is the first time in history. It's not like we're used to this. in Rwanda, in Myanmar, in other cases, in former Yugoslavia, we have not seen every official committing genocide saying that they want to do that, exterminate, end the human animals, and so on and so forth. So in much of the global south, there's this loss of faith in this international legal system, but not just the legal system. Every Western-dominated so-called international institution, like the FIFA and the Olympics, and all those institutions that they are sold to us as international, now we know better. They're white. They're not international. They're white colonial institutions. They're designed to serve white colonial powers, not humanity, not the peoples of those colonial powers either. The trade unions don't benefit from this hegemony. So it's not a white versus black issue. It's power in those white colonial powers versus the rest of humanity. And I think most people in the global south get it. Eventually, in the global north, many people will get it. Many trade unions in the global north are very slow. They're not getting it yet because they're privileged. They still see the privilege. But guess what? Economic power is shifting east. The global west is losing power. Within 10 years, the US will not be the only empire on earth that no one dares to question. At one day, I can see it in my lifetime, US criminals can be held accountable for complicity in genocide. And when that falls, the rest of the domino blocks will fall as well. So it's very important to get that across. And this connects to Nicaragua. No, Nicaragua does not have a Palestinian lobby. We don't have a Palestinian lobby anywhere, maybe in Chile, but it's not a factor. It's and there are issues with the Nicaraguan government, human rights issues and so on, but they get it. They see the writing on the wall. The savage, wild West is destroying Gaza on TV. It's not just Israel. It's every institution that is in bed with Israeli institutions is guilty. Every pension fund that is funding this is guilty. Every government that has said Israel has a right to self-defense, which is not upheld by international law. The UN Charter does not give Israel the right to self-defense against people under its occupation. That's what the ICJ said in 2004, the International Court of Justice. But every one of them is guilty as well, is complicit in this. And the Global South, they get it, most of the Global South. That's why Nicaragua is suing Germany at the International Court of Justice for its complicity in genocide and apartheid. So it's very important. They're not just saying, oh, Germany's complicity started on October 7th. Germany's complicity started in 1948. From the moment the apartheid system was established, Germany was always complicit. But it's far more complicit now by directly supporting and defending and whitewashing the genocide and arming it. So that's why Nicaragua went to court, not because of any Palestinian special factor. If you want, Palestine has become the South Africa of the 80s. Those of us old enough would remember, end of the 80s, how South Africa, if you're progressive, you do something against apartheid in South Africa. Otherwise, you can't call yourself progressive, right? I mean, any one of us who's old enough, you just couldn't be progressive if you did not have a position and did something against apartheid South Africa. Today, Palestine is becoming that. In a way, it's our South Africa moment. And most of the global South gets it. Anyone who says that there isn't a thriving, dynamic Palestinian civil society, unlike South Africa, is making a racist and ignorant statement. They don't know what they're talking about, and they're racist, both. Because factually that's obviously not true. The Norwegian government has been funding so much in Palestinian civil society, and civil society is not just the NGOs, it's also the unions, and it's a lot. And it has played a very important role under the occupation, under the apartheid regime. It has played a critical role in fighting back against the system of oppression. But regardless, this is distracting from the key issue, which is Israel an apartheid state or not? With all due respect to this trade unionist, I don't know her, so I cannot judge about her particularly, but Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch and Israel's biggest human rights organization, B'Tselem, and all Palestinian human rights organizations and UN experts, all of them, basically the consensus in the human rights world, says Israel is an apartheid state. But she doesn't think so. Why do we care what she thinks? I mean, why does it matter what she thinks? It's sickening how some gatekeepers keep holding back a movement because of ignorance and racism, when the reality is so obvious. So there is no question that Israel is an apartheid state. And those who don't know should learn, should read. Something interesting to do about apartheid. Second, this is all to hide the responsibility to act. But, as I've said earlier, it's ethics, it's the law, international law, and it's power. Peaceful power, grassroots power, people power. Without that, nothing moves. Nothing moves. I've been an activist for 42 years. I know from my person, and I'm Palestinian, so I'm pretty experienced. You don't move anything without power. Anything. And it's people power. So against the powers that be, that are trying to suppress our voices, to silence us, to gaslight us, to fool us, to try to lie to us, we need power to fight back. So if the grassroots of any union feel that their leadership is not accountable enough to them on an issue, fight back. Protest loudly. Break this silence and this Norwegian harmony, and we talking nicely in closed rooms. No, public, media, protests, occupations, as many Norwegians are doing today, with the arrests that happened outside Parliament. Yes, we need to shake the stagnant pool. We need to throw a big stone in that stagnant pool of, everyone who disagrees but remains harmonious. No harmony in the time of genocide. You're either pro-genocide or against genocide. You can't take a middle ground.
My name is Saleh Shaban. I'm a Palestinian activist. I have a little comments and questions after. First of all, thank you for the presentation information. And my comments about boycott some company here in Norway, like McDonald's, Starbucks, and etc. Of course, it's important, but I think it's not enough. Maybe it's harmed the economy of Israel, but the painful Israel, if we can push on companies and factories who's sending equipment, military equipment to Israel in this continuous war against the Palestinian people. The genocide is continuing not in Gaza only, in West Bank and the territory and 48. It's not after October 7, it's continued about 76 years. So, now, the question, there is a department against apartheid and racism by PLO. If you have some jobs of kind of jobs or coordination with this department, I know this department will be preparing to conference in South Africa next coming month.
It changed. I'll explain.
Okay. If you will join with this conference. The other question, what the challenge or problems who prevent your job in Europe and around of the world? And the last one, if you have some problems or some actions by Palestinian Authority who prevent your job in West Bank. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, there are two broad challenges we're facing around the world that could take hours. But very quickly, on the conference in South Africa, just to explain, there is a department, anti-apartheid department in the Palestine Liberation Organization, which we have worked with very closely, and we had our first anti-apartheid, unified Palestinian anti-apartheid conference at the end of 2022. And January 2023, we published the Unified Palestinian Anti-Apartheid Call, which is the first time that the PLO, the BDS movement, the Palestinian Authorities Ministry of Justice even was there, PINGO, the Palestinian NGO network, and Palestinian human rights organizations. All of us formed a coalition opposed to apartheid, situating apartheid as a tool of settler colonialism that has existed since 1948, basically. So the analysis was very, very clear by consensus. It did not start in 1967. Settler colonialism and apartheid started in 1948. So there is now a Palestinian anti-apartheid coordinating committee, which all those entities are part of. And we are part of that. The BDS movement is part of that. We did, for months, work with our equivalent in South Africa. There's a South African anti-apartheid steering committee working with us on a conference in South Africa to boost, to escalate global anti-apartheid work. There have been differences now in priorities for the South African partners, and they decided to shift the agenda to something else. So we're no longer part of that. The Palestinian Anti-Apartheid Coordinating Committee is no longer part of the conference. It's not happening. It's another conference, basically, but we're supporting them from outside. We're not organizing with them, but we fully support them. They want to boost support for South Africa because of the ICJ. As you know, South Africa is facing a lot of pressure from the United States, from Europe, because it's taking Israel, their favorite settler colony, to court on genocide. So the Western Club does not like that. So they want to punish South Africa. So we need support for South Africa. So we agree with South African partners. Now, maybe the priority is to get a lot of support for South Africa to enable it to continue its noble struggle to hold Israel accountable for genocide. So that's on this issue. On the Palestinian Authority, we don't have enough time, but very, very quickly, the Palestinian Authority is unelected, undemocratic, unaccountable. No one elected the current government. So we can't hold them as representing the Palestinian people. They don't. The PLO symbolically remains the sole legitimate representative of our people. As problematic as it is, as undemocratic as it is, we need to retake it, take it back, and to rebuild it, because it's ours. My father actually was one of the founders of the PLO in 1964 when I was born. So it's part of my very family, my culture, my life. That's our PLO. It's not this corrupt leader or that PLO. It's our PLO. We have to take it back. But the Palestinian Authority is no one's Palestinian Authority. It doesn't represent anyone, basically. So they should not, and I heard some Norwegian politicians say, oh, but the Palestinian Authority has not asked us for sanctions. First, that's a lie. The official Palestinian Authority, even the Palestinian Authority, as problematic, undemocratic, unelected, unaccountable as it is, at the ICJ on the prolonged occupation case, not the genocide case, the second case, officially said, we call for full sanctions against Israel. So now this is the Palestinian consensus, total consensus. Everyone is calling for sanctions against Israel. And second, when I won't get into Norway, they have to fulfill their obligations. Forget sanctions. You don't need the victim to tell you, oh, can you please stop helping the perpetrator? You have to stop helping the perpetrator anyway, whether the victim shouts or doesn't shout. You can't blame the victim for not shouting. You know, it's a ridiculous argument that, oh, we'll continue doing crime because the victim is not complaining. You're bribing the victim not to complain to start with. I mean, who's bribing the Palestinian Authority not to complain about anything before they called for sanctions? It's Norway and the EU and the US. You made it silent with your money. So don't start using its silence as if it's representative. It's not representative. On obstacles facing BDS, there are many, but very, very quickly, Israel since 2014, let's say, started considering BDS a strategic threat, which put us as a very high priority for the Israeli government to fight us. After that, they dedicated a full ministry in the government for fighting BDS. So we are proud to have a ministry dedicated to us. In court, they said that they're monitoring me 24/7. So I said, so they have 3-4 agents following every breath I take. How much is that costing Israel? So I alone am costing the Israeli economy a lot, which is good. So multiply by so many thousands. So they're very terrified of BDS because it's nonviolent, because it sticks to international law, because it's anti-racist, because it's intersectional. It connects with climate justice, gender justice, social justice, racial justice movements. We're connecting very well with justice movements, and they see the writing on the wall. And because young Jewish Americans are abandoning Zionism and Israel and joining us. So they're terrified of this movement, because how can you find a non-violent anti-racist movement? It's really difficult. We don't make it easy for them. So that's the biggest obstacle. Israel uses its intelligence services, its propaganda machine, which is enormous, and its lawfare, legal warfare. So they sue, they take any, professors, artists, they take them to court. Institutions, they take them to court and sue them for $10 million. They sued a U.S. Small NGO for $80 million for hosting BDS. 80-some million dollars. They lost. And they appealed, and they lost. So they lose a lot of money in those cases, but they don't care. They want to terrify us. They want to silence us. To have this, what they call in English, I don't know if it translates, well, in Norway it makes chilling effect. Here everything is chilling anyway. So that chilling effect, they terrify you so you don't speak. But as I've said before, the chilling effect takes the chiller and the chilled. We do not get chilled. We do not get deterred. We do not accept to get silenced. We keep fighting back.
Yeah, and with that, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge, and we're very thankful that you've taken the time to speak with us, and free Palestine.
Yes, free
Free
Palestine.
Palestine. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.